Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble as it swell. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Come, behold the works of the Lord, how he has brought desolation on the earth. He makes war cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress.
Well, good morning. Good morning. Hey, let me see. Okay, we on? Speaker? Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Well, welcome back, everybody. If you are joining us for the first time, either here in person or online, welcome. It's very good to have you with us. What we've been doing is going through 6 questions that the congregation picked out. Earlier in the spring, they chose 6 questions. They chose a lot of questions, but then they voted on them, and these questions we're going through during the summer is the top 6, and we're kind of about halfway through. This question we have is interesting. It's how can we have peace in an anxious world? And one of the things that makes this one interesting is, as I was counting up all the votes, originally this question wasn't in the top 6. It didn't, I mean, it had a few votes, but it didn't make it quite to the top 6. It didn't become, right now it's question number 3. It didn't become question number 3 or even in the top 6 until I took the votes from the youth group. The youth group voted separately, and once I took the youth group, the votes from the youth group and added up, that was their number 1 question that they had voted on and incorporated it. So all tallied up, it's the overall number 3, but it was the number 1 question for the youth. And that surprised me a little bit. I hadn't stopped to consider what the number 1 question that the teenagers might vote on would be, but this is it. And the statistics seem to bear this out. Over the last 3 years, there's been a lot of anxiety for everybody, right? Young, old, male, female, I don't know if this will embarrass you, but how many in the last 3 years you found yourself at moments just getting a little bit anxious at some point over the last 3 years? Yeah? Okay, that's 5 of you. Okay. I assume there's more than that, but some of you are being a bit shy. I know from having talking to you that for probably the majority of us, it's felt like a bit of a roller coaster these last 3 years. And though this morning we may have arrived feeling good and strong and confident and at peace, most people will be like, yeah, there was a moment a year or 2 or 3 ago, where I kind of lost myself, or I found myself waking up at 4 in the morning and just having these thoughts and being unsure about the future, not sleeping so well at night. That's affected all of us, but it seems to have affected younger people even more. For many of us who are older, the events of the last 3 years, maybe just our age and haven't been, lived during the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall and different things, maybe it gives us a bit of perspective to put in crises and world events, help keep it in perspective. But for a younger person who hadn't seen 9/11, who hadn't seen many of the other tragedies that maybe older people had lived through, it was overwhelming. And sure enough, in terms of mental health and people going to the counselors at school, that shot way up. The amount of people going to their school counselor seeking help with anxiety or depression or mental health issues, it's almost double what it was just 3 years ago. I was collecting just some statistics. But right now, at the moment, all sorts of mental health issues, even loneliness, which we don't often think of as a mental health issue. At the moment, 20% of Americans report being lonely, considering some of the states that had more severe lockdowns than Nebraska did. You can understand being alone in your house, especially if you don't have a family, that could contribute to it. But for younger people, that number is not at 20%, but at 47%, which for younger people is very high. Typically, the loneliest person in American society is a middle-aged male. Middle-aged men tend to be the loneliest typically during society, but at the moment, after we've been through these last 3 years, it's actually more common in younger people. They're experiencing loneliness. I was listening to talking with one counselor just a couple weeks ago. He works here in Nebraska. Suicides have increased a little bit, not as much as you might think, but suicides have increased a little bit over the last 3 years. But what's really happened is what he was calling out of the blue suicides. This is for people who commit suicide, and there's no warning, no indication that one day the person is happy and seems full of life, and there's not the normal hints and clues that the person might be in a bad place. And they said that's what they've been having to deal with, even in churches. Even among, you would hope that in the church you'd be able to raise your hand and say, hey, I'm not okay. But that's not always the case. Sometimes even in churches, we come to church and have the impression that, well, I'm a church member, I'm a Christian, therefore everything's supposed to be okay. And even in some churches, I'm not saying that's the case in our church, but even in some churches, there's this sense that it's not okay to be not okay. And listen, we're just assuming that if you're coming to church, that means you know that you need help. You know you're a sinner. You know you're broken. You know your life is not fully as full with God as it could be. And we're here. If you're here and you're part of our church, that's a way of proclaiming we're not fully okay. And we need the grace of God. And we need the mercy of God. So even in churches, these things are an issue. And I think it is true. I think at Bethel we are good at doing this, but I'd like to see it continue and even grow, that as a culture we can raise up our hand and say, I'm not okay. I'm in a time where it's either depression or anxiety or loneliness that I'm feeling. I might be able to explain why. Maybe I can't explain why, but I'm going through a difficult time. And I need some help, some pastoral help, some help from the body. These are the days we're living in. There's resources out there, and sometimes people don't know about all the resources. I had to look some of this up because having lived in Britain the last many years, I kind of knew the phone numbers and different things of what happened over there, but really haven't been so familiar with over here. There's a whole lot of, if you're in a place and, maybe with your family or your circle of friends or even in your church, which I would hope not be the case, but if it is, there's a lot of resources you can access. For example, I didn't even know this. I didn't grow up with this. This must be a new thing, but how many of you know about we all know about 911, but there's 988. 988, that's the number you can dial for any mental health issue. Not just depression, not just suicide, but 988. So if you're going through stuff and you don't feel you can talk to your family or someone at school or someone at work or even for whatever reason, even in the church, you can dial that number and you can talk to someone. There's also suicide prevention numbers, 1-800-273-TALK. That's 1-800-273-TALK. You can also, if you don't want to talk and you just want to text somebody, you can just write the word TALK all in uppercase. Write the word TALK and text that to 741-741. And you'll just be able to get in a text conversation with someone. Anxiety. It's another word for fear. It's one of many mental health issues that we have to face during our life. And it's not something I'm ever surprised with, either as a pastor or a Christian, just when I'm talking to someone and they say they're anxious, that they say they're fearful. I mean, particularly from if God's not part of your picture. I mean, if someone's not anxious and fearful, I assume they're naive. sometimes. I'm like, do you know what's going on out there? Because, there's a lot of reasons to be afraid. There's plenty of reasons to be anxious. There's plenty of reasons to be upset. Like, if you never feel anxious, if you never feel worried, maybe it's because you're not watching the news. Maybe it's because you're not aware of what's going on in the world. Because there are a lot of things in the world that should make you anxious, particularly if God is not part of that picture. I mean, we are on a rock flying through the middle of the universe, traveling at 25,000 miles an hour or something like this, around a giant explosive nuclear reaction at the center of our universe that one of these days is going to get so big that it consumes the earth, and then we're going to die. And that's going to be, there's a whole lot of reasons to be anxious and worried. And I'm not surprised when people suffer from depression. I'm not surprised when people report they're anxious and maybe numb it with drugs or alcohol. I mean, drugs and alcohol are abuse are definitely issues, even here in Milford. Even maybe within our families, maybe even for us. I mean, that it numbs our consciousness. We get all worried and anxious about what's happening in the world, and we go to something. We drink more than we should, or we take drugs that we shouldn't take. Sometimes even if they're prescription drugs, we take them in a way and in a quantity that we should not, just to numb ourselves to all the problems and the fear happening out there. Sometimes we don't like to think about it, even as Christians. For some of you who maybe you're struggling with sleep, maybe you wake up in the middle of the night. You wake up, 3, 4 in the morning. You wake up earlier than you want to, and your mind is just racing with stuff. Racing with potential problems. Or maybe you're not even thinking about it. You're trying to bury the issue. You're trying not to think about the what ifs. There's evidence that something could be wrong. Now, sometimes that's big social things. That affects all of us. Inflation, or a possible war with Russia, or COVID, or whatever new disease there is. Something like this that maybe would affect all of us, and we're trying to not think about it. Or maybe it's something very personal. Maybe we're worried about the condition of our marriage, or maybe for a younger person, we're worried about the condition of our parents' marriage because we hear them arguing, or maybe it's our job. There's some insecurity at work, and other people have been made redundant or fired, and you're worried that you might be next. And you have these different issues that you're trying not so much to think about. You're burying it, and it's like, I don't know if any of you ever saw the Harry Potter movies or read the books. There's he who must not be named. That's a big part of the books. When Harry Potter first goes to school, no one mentions the name Voldemort. They just call him he who must not be named, as if to say the name or to think anything about Voldemort would make it more real. Now, I know that's just a child's story, but that's the way it is sometimes for us. I'm not going to think too much about the what ifs of what if things go totally wrong with my marriage, or I'm not going to think about the what ifs if things happen with this relationship or this thing at work. I'm not even going to consider it. I'm just going to bury it down there, but part of our brain is designed to consider what ifs. Part of being human is to plan for potential problems and to make plans accordingly. And when we don't do that and just bury it inside of us, it's like your brain is trying to set off a warning, and it's like, think about this. You're like, no, I don't want to think about this. So you wake up and it kind of comes out in fantasy. And what I love about this psalm, Psalm 46, is right at the very beginning, the psalmist says, "Therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam." Now, I know that's poetic language, but isn't that just about the worst case scenario you can think of? All of Nebraska suddenly gets sucked into the earth, and all the waves of the Atlantic and Pacific come up over the coast and wash over all of America, and a great earthquake sucks us down the heart of it. That would be bad, right? Compared to everything else we're worried about right now, our job, or COVID, or my marriage, getting sucked down into the center of the planet, or an asteroid hitting the earth and the oceans washing over us. And that would have to be a big asteroid to get the oceans all the way up here to Nebraska. But, he's thinking about the worst case scenario. And as people, that's not a bad thing to do sometimes. We don't like to think about worst case scenarios, so we tuck it all away. But that just creates an anxiety in us that's hard to explain. We're living under the shadow of he who shall not be named. And the psalmist doesn't do that. He names it, which in the Harry Potter books, that's exactly kind of what indicates that Harry Potter's this special boy, because he's like, why are you all scared of Voldemort? And everyone's like, shh, don't say it, don't say the name. And he keeps saying it. But as Christians, sometimes we need to say, what is it we're afraid of? What is it we're nervous about? And actually sit down and think, or maybe talk with a loved one, what is it that is causing us so much anxiety? What is our fear? Like, what is the worst thing that could happen at your job? You might lose your job or your business. Maybe you're self-employed and you think, okay, what's the worst thing that could happen here? I have to fire a couple employees, or maybe I lose my business and I have to do something else. And so, actually say, what is the worst case scenario? My spouse, what if they leave me? Or I'm having health issues. What is the worst that could happen here? Let's actually say it out loud and talk it through. But as a Christian, we don't just talk it through. We talk it through in the light of who God is. And this starts off in verse 1. He says he's not naive. Like, the guy who writes this is not at all naive. He doesn't have these rose-tinted glasses on. His view of life is not like some, poster from Hobby Lobby with little flowers on it that, makes everything look like, honey and sunshine every day. Like, he has a realistic view of the world. And yet he starts out this psalm by saying, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Because we need refuge sometimes. In life, you're going to need a refuge. Things are going to come at you. There might be personal things. They might be character flaws. It might be sin. It might be a real person or a real thing out there that's out. It might be poverty. It might be sickness. There are times we really need refuge in life. And everyone goes for refuge. You might be watching, you might be listening, you might not be a Christian. What is it you go to for a refuge? For some, it might be alcohol. It just at least takes the pain away. It numbs things. Too much alcohol or drugs. Let's do this. My life's a wreck. My family's falling apart. Life's not working out for me the way it should. At least drugs can provide some sort of relief. Pornography, chat rooms, different things. It can become unhealthy where we go to. It's not even that these things are always the problem. Very often they're the false solution to a deeper problem. Because we're not getting these things taken care of in a healthy way. We go to other things to try to medicate ourselves. Again, and some of these things aren't always bad, like eating. Eating's not bad. God created eating. God created food. Great. But there's a type of emotional eating where it's like, man, life's too much. Give me the chocolate ice cream. That's it. And that's what I go to. And whenever life gets too stressed, we just go to the fridge and we just start snacking. It's not because food is evil, but we look into it to solve a problem that it is really never meant to fulfill. We all have refuge. You're an atheist, you're Muslim, you're Jewish, you're a pagan. What's your refuge? We say we're Christians, but very often we seek refuge in other things. And the psalmist says, listen, God is our refuge. And not only that, he's our strength. Because sometimes God protects us from a problem, but other times he gives us strength to stand firm in the midst of the problem. And he's a very present help. And like that word, very present, it's one of these Hebrew words that can have a lot of different shades of meaning. It's a very present help, but it's also like a tried and true. It's like your favorite chair you might have at home. Any of you guys got like a favorite chair? Like I have a favorite chair in our living room that I go to read in, and when either the cat is there or one of my kids are there, I'm like, get out. That's Papa's chair. That's my chair. Like, it fits me just right. It's good for reading. I like the armrest like that. That's my chair right there. You're in. It's like God is that tried and true, reliable. You know it's going to hold you. You know it's going to be just right. He's our very present help in times of trouble. If you're not in a time of trouble right now, wait around for 5 minutes. These things come. They happen in life. Therefore, as we already read, we will not fear though the earth gives way. And he just named some of the worst possible things that could happen. Don't be afraid, as I keep saying, don't be afraid to name those things out loud. Either to yourself and just sit down and think it through. Maybe write it down if you journal. Journaling is a great habit. Write it down. What's the worst thing that could happen? Economically, in terms of my marriage, with my kids, or with my parents. Like, right, I'm going to think these things through and think it through and put yourself in a position where you say, you know what, even if that happens, and hopefully it doesn't, but even if that happens, I'm going to choose. Before I even get there, I'm going to make a choice to go forward in God. And God's going to see me through, and somehow He's going to even take the worst of it and somehow use it for my good. Because the stress of life, and life can be incredibly stressful. Life can be incredibly painful, but it's very different experience when it happens to you and you have no choice, and when you enter into it voluntarily. Now, of course, many things we can't control, but we can prepare ourselves and think ahead, and even though we can't stop some things like disease or maybe losing our job or even whether our spouse leaves us or our parents get divorced or something like this, even though we can't always control that, we can prepare ourselves ahead and say, okay, no matter what happens, I'm going to choose to go ahead into these new life circumstances with God, and He's going to be my refuge and strength, and I'm going to choose to go forward in it, and this suffering that I have to endure is going to become an adventure, and I'm going to become a more godly, better, more loving, peaceful, joyful, happy person at the other end. I'm going to go through this valley, and I'm going to come out in the other end. And you prepare yourself as if you are voluntarily assuming responsibility for it. You are choosing not to be just a victim, but to go through it, and that changes how you experience it and process it. Jesus is going to be my shepherd, and I am going to walk through this valley of shadow of death. I'm not just going to sit there feeling alone like a helpless victim. I'm going to go through the valley of the darkness of the valley of the shadow of death, as the psalmist says. That makes a huge difference to the type of person you're going to become when the worst happens, because every now and then in life, the worst does happen. And you make a choice beforehand that I will not fear. I will not be afraid. Now, when he says don't be afraid, it doesn't mean that these, anxious feelings don't come. But you say, right, God is going to be with me. He's going to be bigger than the problem. And that's bravery. Like, bravery is not just, I don't have any negative, I don't ever feel anxious. Bravery is, yes, I feel anxious, but yes, I'm going to go forward. I'm going to say, yes, these are the circumstances, and yes, I know it could even get worse than it is. But I'm going to go forward in God and choose to believe in His goodness. In the midst of all this chaos, in the midst of this crisis, I'm going to believe in the goodness of God, and I'm going to walk forward. Verse 4. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God will help her when the morning dawns. The psalmist is talking about God now, and maybe for some of you who are watching, or some of you are here, you're thinking, okay, is this just the answer? I'm anxious, therefore the answer is God. Like, is it that simple, or is it that trite? Well, yes and no. A lot of times the way we think, we kind of tend to think in categories of like spiritual answers on this side and practical answers on this side. But the Christian view of the world is not, well, here are spiritual things and here are nuts and bolts practical things. In a sense there is, but God is God over all of it. That's why for some of you who are dealing with anxiety, the best thing I can tell you to do is to get a good night's sleep. The best thing I do is to tell you to, when you wake up in the morning, don't eat Fruity Pebbles for breakfast. Like, have a solid, big, protein-rich breakfast. One of the most spiritual things you can do is to make your bed first thing every morning and keep your room tidy. And you'd be surprised how that affects your anxiety levels. Get more sleep, exercise a little bit, not necessarily a lot, maybe just 10 minutes a day or whatever. Go out for a walk, that's all you can do. And we think, oh, those sorts of things don't have anything to do with God. No, God's over all of it. In the New Testament, when Paul is writing to Timothy at the end of his letters, what does he say about you? Make sure to drink a little bit of wine because you have these upset stomachs, and wine, this wine has some medicinal effect on your stomach. He doesn't just say, well, make sure, you say the Holy Spirit 4 times every time before you eat something. He's like, no, God is God over what we think of as spiritual answers as well as practical answers. The very first commandment God gives mankind is a very nuts and bolts practical command. In Genesis chapter 1, the first commandment to the man and the woman, Adam and Eve, is not, well, just go off and pray a whole lot. The very first command is fill the earth, take dominion over it, exercise authority. I have created you to be a man and a woman. Go out into the world. So, it starts off, God creates the world, and it's all wild and overgrown and crazy, but there's this one nice, organized, neat garden called Eden. And that's a garden, which is nature, but it's nature tamed. And then he tells the man and woman, multiply, have lots of kids, and fill the earth and make the whole earth look like this garden. And that's like the command for human beings, like for all of our lives. It's like, how many of you, your bedroom looks more like the wilds of the world outside of the garden versus Eden itself? It's like, right, our command is to try to take some dominion over our lives and over the circumstances that we have control over and put some sort of sense of order to it. And so sometimes having good mental health and dealing with anxiety, it's incredibly practical. It can be changing your diet. It can be changing what time you go to sleep. So when we talk about God being our help, some of you are already checking out and saying, oh, no, I need a practical answer. Now, this is important. I don't know if you saw the news 2 or 3 weeks ago that came out. How many saw a headline? A number of different, both conservative and liberal news outlets were running it. Some of the things that got uncovered about, a lot of the medicine Americans take for depression, like it being based on a number of studies from the early 90s that have been completely discredited. Like they were proven to be a fraud. Like this whole thing of serotonin levels in the brain, and this whole multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical complex has been built on a couple of studies from the early 90s that were fraudulent, that were corrupt. And actually, that's why many people, and I'm not saying I'm not a doctor, nor do I play one on TV. And so I'm not trying to give anyone any medical advice here. Simply what they were saying is what they were trying to do, and why some people, not everyone, I don't know enough about this to comment, but why some people were taking these medications and sometimes getting addicted to them, and it's sometimes not even really working, is because the basis for it was, they kind of got to go back to the drawing board. I'm not saying there's not a time for Christians to take medicine for depression. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. I don't know enough about that sort of thing. I'm simply saying whether you deal with something through medicine, or through diet, or through exercise, or developing a prayer life, it's not like there are God answers and non-God answers. It's all God answers. Whether it's taking an aspirin or memorizing a scripture verse, that's a God answer. And we take it. And it's Him helping us with our issues. And so he's talking here in verses 4 to 5. God, the picture is of this city. Now, for us, this doesn't mean a whole lot. But to the ancient Hebrews, this meant tons. A river flowing through a city, what would that provide in the Bronze Age? Back 3,000 years ago, for us, if we live near a city that has a river flowing through it, which I used to. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. We have the James River going through, which originally, when Richmond was founded, traders would come up through the Atlantic, through the Chesapeake Bay, it would stop in Richmond because that's when the rapids began. So they couldn't go up any further up the James River. And so we have a river running through our city. I grew up with this idea of a river in the city. Well, that was good for trading, but in the Bronze Age, why else would that have been important? Any guesses? Yeah, source of water. Source of water and source of food. It's got fish in there. Now, in the Bronze Age, especially in this region of the world, the ancient Near East, this was big because, like, if in the later part of the 20th century, the big fear was nuclear war, and if in our day and age, it's maybe bioweapons and gain-of-function research on the Ebola virus or something like that. Maybe that's our big fear. Back during the Bronze Age in the ancient Near East, it was that your city would come under siege. Like, the worst thing that could happen. If you lived out, let's say you didn't live in the city, but you lived out in one little village, and there was a foreign army coming. All the villagers and all the towns surrounding the city would come into the main city that had walls, and you bring everything in. But then the army would camp around those walls, and you would be under siege. And that idea would terrify people living 3,000 years ago in the Bronze Age, because that was like, you run out of water, you run out of food, you starve to death, you end up cannibalizing one another. Like, it's like a nightmarish situation. But if you have a river running through your city, wow, that is such a big help, because it gives you the water. You're not going to all die of thirst, and especially in that region of the world where things are hot and dry, and at least you might not have a lot of food, but at least you might have some resource to get fish. And so the psalmist is talking about, there is a city that makes glad, there's a river that makes glad the city of God. Now, does Jerusalem have a river flowing through it? Nope, it doesn't. It doesn't. You have to walk, maybe 10 miles or so, maybe a little more, to get to the Jordan River or to the Dead Sea. Not that there's any fish in the Dead Sea, but salty fish maybe, I don't know. But there's no river there, but he's saying God is our river. God is our river in this city. Like, he will take care of us even when we're under siege. Contextually in the Bible, what's happening in Psalm 46, 47, 48. So there's these three Psalms, 46, 47, 48. Most scholars, they're all thematically related, like they're very similar. There's the similar ideas they're bouncing around in these three Psalms. Most people think this is what happened when Jerusalem came under siege. There's this one episode in Israel's history when Assyria came. Assyria had already fought the northern kingdom of Israel, and they come down to Judah. And, the capital of Judah was Jerusalem. And they all came in, and they were under siege. And Hezekiah, who was the king, prayed, and God just created a great deliverance where people in the camp started dying. Whether God sent a disease or what, or just an angel or what, we don't, they just started dying and they had to leave. And God rescued the city. And therefore a lot of commentators, Jewish and Christian, think, this psalm was probably written right after God delivered them from this Assyrian siege in the city. And so he's saying, you know what? Our God being with us is even better than having a river flowing through our city. It's like, yeah, okay, some cities have a river flowing through it, and we don't have that, but we have one better. We have the river of God flowing with us. And so he's making this comparison. He's like, and you know what? In life, you might not have resources to help like some others. Maybe you're in a situation where you're hearing about inflation, you're hearing about possible difficulties that we might go through as a nation, and you might look at somebody else. Maybe you have a neighbor who's much more financially well off than you. And you might think, well, maybe they can afford that extra 10% inflation hike, but we can't. And you could say this is kind of similar to the guy saying, he's like, well, other cities have this river flowing through it. We don't have that, but you know what's our help? God's going to get us through this. God is our help. And he's even better than a river. The nations rage. How many of you guys noticed some nations raging in the news lately? Like, nations rage. Yes. Do nations rage? Yes. Do kingdoms totter? Yes. Kingdoms and their economies totter. I don't need to give much comment on that. You guys know what's going on. Kingdoms totter, nations rage, the earth melts. But the Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Sometimes it seems like everything in the world's going wrong. Guys, the best thing you have with you is that God is present. Guys, I can't promise you that everyone at school is going to like you. You might be at the bottom of the social ladder and not have any friends. I can't promise you that things in your career at work are going to go out well. I can't promise you that your business will succeed and do well. Now, if you're going through one of those hard times, you can come forward after the service and I'll pray with you. I do believe God hears and answers prayer, and He does miracles. And yes, I believe God can provide you with a friend. I believe He can help you in your career. I believe He can do all these things. And yet I can't make any promises how God's help is going to come and what His plan for you is. God may shut one door that you really want to go through and then open another door somewhere else. But the one thing we can say is that God is with us. We might not know what God's plan for our lives is, but when we can't trace His hand, we can trust His heart. And that is He loves us, and He cares for us, and He's with us, and He's bigger than any problem we face. Come behold the works of the Lord, how He has brought desolations on the earth. We're scared of some of the, we have these boogeymen out there, and for a good purpose. You hear about sometimes what the Chinese Communist Party is doing, or what the president of Russia, Putin, is doing, or the WEF, or these different things. We have these Baba Yagas, these boogeymen out there that scare us. And I'm not saying there's not any just cause to be concerned about certain things internationally. And yet, we serve the God who brings desolations on the earth. God can wreak havoc on some of these organizations or governments or strong men or dictators that make us fearful. God can lift up kings and governments, and God can also take them out. Our trust is in God. Christ is not on His throne wringing His hands being like, oh, I wish they'd be nicer to each other. Oh, I wish they wouldn't do that. It's like, no, we serve an almighty God who's stronger than these other forces that we're worried about in the earth. And He can, just like He can build up, He can tear down. He makes wars to cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. And here's His answer at the end. After going through all these terrible things that could possibly happen, here's what He says to you and me to do, practically. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. Guys, this is where human history is going. I realize that for some of us, our anxiety is personal. It's about just what's happening in our life, with our career, our school, our friends, our marriage, our kids, our parents. But other times we're anxious about what's happening in the world on a global scale. And here's what He's saying about where human history is headed. Human history is headed in a direction, and it is Christ Jesus being exalted in every nation, among every tribe, among every people group. And a number that cannot be, a multitude that cannot be numbered, being gathered before the throne to praise Christ. Satan will roar. He will come at us. There'll be different wars and rumors of wars. But in the end, Christ will be preached in every nation, and He will gather a people to Himself, and He will be exalted and over all the earth. That is where human history is headed. Like St. George will beat the dragon. They will rescue the princess. It will all work out in the end. We as Christians, we believe in happy endings. Not just happy endings, but where things go back to being as good as they were before. We believe in uber happy endings, where things actually just don't go back to the good they were before, but they go back to be even better than they were before. And maybe we don't see it in our lifetimes. Maybe we die, and it's in the lifetimes of our grandchildren that things come back around, and that evil thing that happened somehow gets turned about for good. Okay, human history is a lot bigger than you and me. But in the end, no one gets away with anything. And God's happy ending will come to pass. Be still. Sit down. Stop being so anxious. Stop being so neurotic. Sit down, be still before God, and know that he's going to be exalted in all the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob, he is our fortress. We're going to take a minute. What we're going to do just now is we're going to take a minute to do just that, to be still. We're going to have a moment, instead of ending with a prayer, just going to end with a moment of silence. And what I'd like you to do is think about what is it you're anxious about, what is it you're afraid of. Well, we all got something. Maybe it's something happening on a global scale, maybe it's just personal to you alone. I want you to think about that thing. Don't hide from it, but think about it. Think about the worst that thing could happen, but then bring it before God, who's much bigger. You can close your eyes, you can open your eyes, and if you can go back just to that last verse. Just meditate on that verse. Just close your eyes. We're just going to take a time of silence. All right. Okay, as with all of these questions we've been going through, at the end we do have a time of Q&A. So if you have any questions at all related to what we've talked about this morning, just raise your hand and shout out your question, and I'll try to address it to the best of my abilities. How do we have peace in an anxious world? Yes, Nancy.
How do you see our church being able to help those that are going through depression and anxiety?
Yeah.
How do you see the church as a whole going out and helping and being God's hands?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, how can we as a church help those outside in the wider community with anxiety and mental health issues? One, I don't know if I have the best, a couple things come to mind. I don't know if I have any definitive answer. One is that there are a lot of lonely people out there. And I love it when we as a church can have events, and we take for granted our community. We get here beforehand and we talk with one another, and people pray with one another and ask how we're doing, and we hang out afterwards and talk with one another. We have potluck dinners, and we have things going on midweek and smaller groups. That's great. Some people don't have that. Now we're not in a city where there's lots of lonely people living in apartments. Most people in our community live in a house with other people, and yet there's still lonely people out there. And so just inviting people to be part of our community, to extending friendship to those outside of our church. We have the opportunity, like even on Saturday, the 10th of September, we're moving our potluck outside, getting some bouncy castles out there for kids, and inviting people along. And hopefully we can extend help, support, encouragement to people. I think that at least being a hospitable, welcoming community that exists for those outside as well as those inside, at least can be part of it. There are also things we can, suggest to people that, like I said, I believe it's still a God answer, even though it's not typically what we think of as a spiritual answer. But a lot of mental health issues are related to use of technology, diet, sleeping patterns. If you're up on your phone going to all sorts of places in the internet until 2, 3 in the morning, the next morning you have to wake up, it's going to affect your mental health. We can give suggestions to people. We can model healthy ways of living and talk to people about that. Now, hopefully that can create a bigger thing. Well, it's like, if the person says, well, I'm really anxious because I know I'm going to die someday, it's like, well, that's a little bit bigger than simply changing your diet. Let's talk about Christ who rose from the dead and offers an ultimate hope. So sometimes we can give a very practical answer, here's how I've changed my diet and it's helped me. Or sometimes we can point to an even bigger solution, which is Christ raised from the dead. We're inviting people to become part of our community. We can't fix all the problems in the world. I can't fix a possible world with Russia, a war with Russia. We can't fix the inflation at 10%. We can't fix all the problems in this world. And that's good for us to know as the church. Sometimes there's this pressure. Oh, what's the Christian response to injustice or racial tensions or the economy? What's the Christian answer for this? It's like, I don't know. Politics and social issues, sometimes they're complicated. And sometimes we can feel a pressure to have an answer to all of the socio-political, economic problems in this world. And sometimes we've got to shrug our shoulders and say, we just don't have them. We can't fix all the problems out there in the world where Christ is, not named as king. But at the very least we can do is invite them into a kingdom where Christ is king. And that's a very different king. We can't always, we can help. I'm not saying we become insular. We can help with problems out there in the world, but we can't necessarily fix them all. This world and all of its problems are fading away, and God's bringing about a whole new world. And we can invite people to be a part of that. So we can at least bring good news to people. And we do that through our actions as well as our words. And, based on your personality and your giftings, you'll do that in different ways. I know that some of us show God's goodness and love more through practical means, and others of us are more talkers, and that's great. It takes all sorts, Did that address the question? Okay. Anybody else? Yes, Dave.
This might be a more personal question,
yeah.
But so if we encounter someone with anxiety or that needs to speak with someone that's beyond our ability, can we say that you could speak with our pastor? He's willing to counsel you?
Yeah, I'm not trained as a therapist. I'm trained in textual hermeneutics, and first of all, but yes, most pastors, probably in this community, and some pastors may be more professionally trained in this than I am. Most pastors love meeting with people just to listen, maybe read some encouraging verses to them, pray for them. My experience in both Europe and America is that in cities, people tend to use their church pastors a lot more for counseling than in smaller rural communities. And I've noticed that both in America and Britain. When I used to work in the city, I remember we lived and worked in the center of Nottingham, which is a city think Robin Hood, that's that Nottingham, and there's actually a young city, single city. Most people lived alone in apartments. My week was filled with people coming to me to talk about their issues. It was like, I've got this addiction, and I broke up with my girlfriend, or my boyfriend did this to me. It's like, just throughout the week, people just came with issues, and they wanted biblical counseling. When I moved to a more rural setting, kind of outside the city, that got reduced by 80%. Where if I had 4 appointments a week in the city, I had 2 a month out in the country. And I don't know why. I think there's different reasons for that. Sometimes people in the country, maybe they have less need of that because they live in family units, or because in smaller communities like Milford, there's this sense that if you have a secret, you want to keep it. If you have issues, you might want to keep that secret, because if one person finds out, chances are the gossip's going to go around the community and everyone's going to know about it in 5 minutes. Whereas in the city, there's this sense of anonymity. I go out of my apartment, I go to the cafe, no one knows me. I'm surrounded by strangers. And sometimes that feels lonely, but other times that feels good. I can be an idiot, make a mistake, and do something, or tell one person, and that's fine. I'm never going to see that stranger again. So I do think, in my experience, people are more slow to come forward in smaller communities like this. And they're careful. Some people, it's probably likely that some of you, if you're struggling with needs, you would probably sooner go to Lincoln to get a counselor or a therapist than to try to find one here in Milford, because you don't want everyone in Milford to know you have a problem. You know, so even going to your pharmacist, you know, you want to be careful what medicines you get at the local pharmacist, because someone might hear that you're getting X, Y, or Z, and you don't want them to know. So, you know, you'll go all the way to Lincoln to go to the pharmacy, and that's typical of small communities in Britain and Europe and America. But to specifically answer your question, yes, I'm happy to meet with somebody, both within the church that's part of our congregation, as well as anyone outside. And you know, if they're not a believer, that may start with practical things like, hey, what do you eat for breakfast in the morning? You know, the conversation just might start there. And if the person's open, we might get more towards matters of faith. Did that kind of address? Kind of, okay. Do talk more afterwards. Anybody else?
How much should we be listening to the news, everything that's going on around?
Yeah. I would encourage one good practice that I've done on and off. And I wish I was a little more disciplined at this, but I've done this for a season and then not done it for a season and go back is take a news / social media Sabbath, where one day a week I don't watch the news, I don't read the news, don't even go on social media, because that's how I hear about a lot of news, people talking about events going on in the world. And sometimes in seasons of my life I do that. Again, I'm not always strict on myself in doing that. But I find that when I do that, man, I go to bed that night, I've had a great day. I feel at peace, and I feel so much better, you know. And then the next morning I'll be like, oh, this is happening in the world again. Spending too much time on the news or social media through which we hear a lot of news can be a good idea. And if you're dealing with anxiety, another one of those things, along with having a good night's sleep and maybe a bit of exercise, some people even take cold showers in the morning, you know, can be, you know, cut down on your use of social media and consumption of news if you're in an anxious season. I mean, just try to go a whole day without any news, any social media. See how you feel going to bed that night. You may feel a lot better. For some, I've heard many people say that that's been very helpful, to turn off the news, or at least to reduce it. We don't necessarily want to be ignorant of the big things happening in the world, like we're at war. You know, it's nice to know about just so you can pray, but to constantly hear, you know, our news work is a commercial industry. It's corporate news. They get, every time you click on an article and get taken to their website, they get money. You know, they get money for ratings, and so they try to make it as sensationalistic as possible. They get money on the basis of you being afraid. And so their headlines, the way they sell the news, because they are trying to sell the news for you to watch them, is to make you afraid. So, you know, we watch the news. There should be a godly cynic inside of you when you watch the news. Be like, yeah, maybe not. Maybe it's not as bad as that. Maybe it, you know. So be discerning in your news consumption. And yeah, I would say it's a great habit to at least one day a week just turn it off entirely. Have a weekly Sabbath. It's been good. When I've done it, it's been good for me. Anybody else? Great. Hey, we've talked about anxiety and fear, and specifically in mental health more broadly. If you're here and you think, man, that's just in the season of life I'm in, and you would like someone to pray with you at the end of the service, I would be happy to just listen to what it is you're going through, and just to pray with you. Or maybe you can't do it right now because you have a roast at home, you're having lunch prepared. Again, happy to meet somebody during the week if you would like to come by here or to meet up for coffee, and just as your pastor to listen to you, pray for you. Again, no, I'm not professionally trained as a therapist, so I'm not going to go there and try to do those sorts of things, but just listening and encouragement and to try to bless you, and in any way I can as a pastor, love to be able to do that. So let's pray, and that'll be it for this week. Next week, how many of you guys have been looking forward to the pink one? And how many think it was color coordinated to be pink for a reason? All right, next week, big question coming up, LGBT issues. I know for a lot of us that is a huge, explosive deal. So pray for your pastor this week as he prepares. Father, we do thank you that you are our fortress, our rock in the midst of difficult times. I pray for all of those going through who are either feeling lonely or depressed or anxious or afraid for personal reasons or larger reasons. Lord, may we know you and your goodness and your presence with us, Lord. Amen. All right, be blessed. Have a great week.